Metu Neter, Volume 1, The Great Oracle of Tehuti and the Egyptian System of Spiritual Cultivation, by Ra-Un-Amen Nefer. Author's Preface. The Divine Plan. We live in a world that was created and is maintained by the unified working of a multiplicity of agencies. We live in a world that is composed of a multiplicity of entities that are unified through a web of interdependence. In the infancy of his spiritual evolutionary career, man is unable to perceive the hidden forces and abstract principles that unify the working of the shaping forces of the world and the entities that make up the world. He creates, therefore, a way of life, systems of religion, science, economics, government, education, family, philosophy, etc., that is incapable of establishing and maintaining unity, law, order, peace, harmony in the world. Thus, the world has been plunged and is sinking deeper day by day into the jaws of death. It is true that he has amassed a great number of facts concerning the workings of nature and a great collection of ideas concerning religion and so on. But the possession of a mass of facts, however reliable the facts are, does not constitute the possession of a science, nor does the possession of a collection of ideas about religion constitute the possession of a religion. For the knowledge contained in these facts regarding nature and these ideas concerning religion does not embody the principles that are necessary to unify the facts and ideas. It is only when the facts concerning nature or the ideas about religion are linked to each other and to the whole that a science or a religion is formed. Man's perception of the world, however, cannot change the reality that the world is shaped and maintained by a unified multiplicity of agencies, and that the world is made up of an infinitude of interdependent entities. This reality has been known to black and oriental cultures and ignored by Westerners as far back as history can take us. The black nations of antiquity, through the cultivation of the science of inducing the state of waking trance, which enables man to perceive the working of abstract principles and the hidden shaping forces of the world, were able to create a way of life systems of religion, science, philosophy, government, and economics, etc., that was capable of establishing and maintaining unity, and thus led to the creation of civilization. Unity, harmony, and order in society cannot be achieved through the making of laws by man and the policing of people's behavior. As man's life on earth is a product of the Supreme Being's creative process, every aspect of man's life is therefore controlled by the divine creative agencies. Unity and thus prosperity in society can only be achieved by man's efforts to intuit the knowledge of how the divine agencies are shaping his life, i.e., to intuit the knowledge of the divine plan. It follows logically that the divine plan would contain the knowledge of the unifying principles of the multiplicity of shaping forces of the world and of the entities making up the world. Through it, all things and events in the world were unified. Religion with science, with government, with philosophy, with medicine, and so on. Man with nature, with God, etc. It achieved this monumental accomplishment by assigning to each event, force, entity, and idea a place in space, hierarchy, rank, and time. It is the purpose of this book to give the reader a working knowledge of this system. The divine plan is presented in this book, not as the museum pieces that are the delight and folly of historians, but as a system to be lived. The jab at historians was thrown both in jest and in seriousness. The fun side is dictated by the fact that they have cumulatively amassed a great deal of facts on our past, for which we must be grateful. The other side is dictated by the fact that Although most historians of religious subjects know of their lack of first-hand experience of the religious phenomena they report on, it does not stop them from arrogating to themselves the aura of authoritativeness in reporting, explaining, and passing judgments. Although the material in this book has the full support of historical documentation, I am writing foremost as a priest of over 20 years of practice. I am here presenting a practical syncretism of the best that the Khemetic, ancient Egyptian, the Dravidian, Black India, and the Canaanite, true authors of Kabbalah, religions have to offer. They were among the 6 nations that laid the foundation of civilization, but it would be folly on our part to merely document this fact and to compile and explain a list of who, when, why, and what. Would it not be a sign of intelligence to be more interested in the methods employed by them for the creation of civilization, that we may learn and apply them to its recreation? If the religious and philosophical systems of ancient civilizations were so great, why aren't we practicing them? Yes, in this volume, one of many, as the topics are too broad to be fully explained in one book, I have given the world the means through which everyone can discover the links between all aspects of life, the means of discovering the plan, the structural continuum that the Supreme Being has put in place to enable the events in the world to unfold in an orderly and harmonious way. Become the plan and let peace, prosperity, and spiritual realization reign in the world. Hotep, Ra-un-Nefer Amen the First, Shechem or Shechem of the Auser Aset Society, Asher Ashemu of the Shrines of Taui, New York, USA, April 24th, 1990. Chapter 1. Introduction. The world is on a collision course with disaster, not only from or because of the threat of nuclear war, but from the massive collapse of its institutions, political, social, economic, religious, spiritual, educational. It is the combined failure of these institutions and traditions that is at the root of the widespread decay and stagnation that we are witnessing in just about every nation in the world. This state of affairs, a Khemetic, ancient Egyptian priestess would say, is due to lack of self-knowledge. This injunction has been quoted often by scholars, yet none have given much insight into its true meaning. In explaining what is knowledge of self, I ought to begin, it seems most natural, at the beginning. But that would take us into such an abstruse discussion that it makes better sense to start instead at a very familiar midpoint. Let's start with what you are doing this very moment. As your eyes race across these lines, I want you to make the effort of becoming aware of the fact that you are involved in 2 sets of functions. On one hand, you are making the effort to keep your attention on the sequence of words as you read on. On the other hand, without your conscious effort and awareness, the meaning of what you are reading is taking shape. These 2 sets of functions are more apparent in more complex activities. While you need to think of getting up and going somewhere, you need not think of the details of the muscular activities involved in getting up itself. They are taken care of for you. When you type, dance, play an instrument, perform in a sport, drive, write, etc., you can become aware of the fact that some part of your activities is performed without conscious effort. Now, this dualization of your being into 2 fundamental sets of functions is the central theme of self-knowledge. One part of your being is concerned with activities that you have to direct, while the other deals with activities that occur without your attention to them. You may have noticed that I have gone to a little trouble to avoid the popular designations voluntary versus involuntary, or conscious versus subconscious behavior. We will later see why. Let us for now label them willed and automatic, respectively. It might not surprise you because you already know that great performers make poor teachers. Yet, you might be surprised to know that you could not give an accurate description of how you walk, or articulate the words that you speak, etc. You fail for the same reasons that most great performers do as teachers. The performance of the task in question is carried out without your attention and awareness of the intricate details involved. You direct your attention to the desired result, and the other part of your being, unattended, takes care of the execution. In fact, as you sit here, this other part is, without your attention or consent, determining what understanding you are extracting from what you are reading. And at the same time, it is taking care of your breathing, exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide in your blood, circulating the latter through every cell in your body, probably digesting some food, and getting ready to shut down the part of you that directs activities. That, the automatic part of being, may have more freedom and energy to do some major repairs on your vehicle while you sleep, among many, many other very complicated things. It should be obvious by now that there exists a vast difference in the knowledge and capabilities between the two parts of our being. While the willed part of our being has to be instructed and is no better in its performance than the quality of the material taught it, the automatic part of being is directed by an omniscient factor. Let's realize that it directed the formation of the physical part of our being the very moment that our progenitor sperm and egg came together. What if the willed part of our being, instead of learning from the nescient will of others, learned from the omniscient being that directs the automaton within us? I.e., instead of the limited in knowledge learning from the limited in knowledge, learn from the omniscient. The answers to these questions will provide full insight into the nature of our being, the cultures we have produced, the shaping forces of our history, and explain the causes of the problems besetting mankind, and will also show definitively the way to their solutions. It is sufficient to say for now that according to African spiritual tradition, the automaton within us is in touch with all functions in the world and is capable of manipulating them. With the proper directions, we will come to see that there are three kinds of people in the world. One type inclines toward relying on the willed part of being for survival and flourishment, the second on the omniscient intelligence and the automaton, and the third on an equilibrium of both parts of being. In fact, all cultures fall into one of these categories. These three categories do not represent distinct types, but stages in the spiritual development of individuals and nations. The first stage corresponds to the polarization in the willed outer part of the being, the second in the polarization in the inner, and the third to their equilibration. We can better comprehend this if we paraphrase it as the stages of 1. Reliance on the part of being with limited knowledge and capability. 2. Reliance on the part of being with infinite knowledge and capability. And 3. The equilibrium between the two. Another paraphrase will explain further. 1. Polarization in learning from outside of ourselves, from someone else. 2. In learning from within ourselves. And 3. An equilibrium of both approaches. Further still, 1. Polarization in reliance on externals, tools, machinery, medicines, etc. 2. Polarization in reliance on internals, the power of the spirit. And 3. The equilibrium of both methods. We can begin to see which cultures shape up to which categories. The first type, polarized in the cultivation of the external part of being, corresponds fundamentally to Western man in some Orientals, while the opposite, polarized in the cultivation of the internal, corresponds to the black race in some Orientals. Success in the cultivation of both parts has only been truly achieved by the Khemeticians, ancient Egyptians, who for the record belong to the black race. Now we can understand why, for example, all the fundamental skills and institutions of civilization began with black nations. Kemet, ancient Egypt, Sumer, Babylon, Elam, the Harappa Valley civilization, Kush, Ethiopia, Indus Kush, Black India, and Canaan. Because of their people's ability to learn from the internal part of being, with its storehouse of knowledge concerning every secret of the world, they were able to intuit, 6,000 plus years ago, the knowledge that forms the basis of our civilization: religion, mathematics, geometry, medicine, astronomy, writing, literature, agriculture, metallurgy, government, architecture, painting, sculpturing, algebra, science, etc. Because Western man is polarized in the cultivation of the external part of his being, he had to learn these skills from others, blacks and Orientals, who are able to learn these things intuitively. This brings us to the critical part of our introductory discourse. Underlying all the functions of the automaton within us is a program of order. The maintenance of our bodily processes in a state of order according to this program is what we call health. We will come to see that this very same program of order is in charge of regulating the social behavior of people, where it finds full expression in the social arena. There is morality, wealth, spirituality, and prosperity. True religion, we will come to see, deals with the techniques of communicating with the director of the automaton within us, in order to gain access to the power, storehouse of information, and the host of shaping factors of our lives. The world is in the sorry mess that it now finds itself because the dominant culture in the world is that of the external part of being. It is not enough to say that the external part of our being does not know much about creating and maintaining order. For even if it did, it lacks the ability to generate order in the life of people. Hearing sermons and reading books, external means, on moral behavior will make you as moral as reading books on healing will heal your illnesses. The most that a book on health, for example, can do is to direct you to some means of directly influencing the automaton. Yet such information must have originated from some person's intuition. The same holds true for religions, moral, and spiritual behavior. All teachings on the subjects originated from the inner part of people's being. If you observe very carefully, you will see that in the religions of the dominant cultures today, people are directed outside themselves to scriptures, sermons from priests, etc., for moral and spiritual guidance. In contrast, African and some Oriental cultures direct their members within themselves, trance, for intuitive guidance for the same ends. The differences are vast. We must recall the fact that the external part of being, however lucid on a subject, lacks the power to direct the processes that shape our behavior and bodily functions. Now we can fully understand the lack of wisdom in denouncing Westerners as hypocrites for preaching doctrines of such high moral values, while their destructive acts in the world are unparalleled. The inner culture for accessing the program of order that is the shaping force of a harmonious social life, an essential prerequisite for man's spiritual growth and the flourishing of all social institutions, has been displaced by the outer culture, which is far from equal to the task, although it is long on words on the subject of spirituality. A detailed account of the history of this phenomenon is necessary for the understanding and use of the teachings in this book. But first, we must get a better grasp of the structure of the subject. The hemispheres of the brain. During the last 40 years or so, the Western scientific community has come to realize that the human brain is composed of two parts with diametrically opposed yet complementary functions. They are known as the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. To understand this subject, we must realize that underlying all mental activities are two sets of functions, one in charge of relating us and the variety of things in our environment to each other and to the whole, and the other function is in charge of separating us and the variety of things in our environment from each other. The latter function, which corresponds to the left hemisphere of the brain, enables us, for example, to distinguish between the sounds made in speaking and verbal thinking, that we will be able to speak and think verbally. The language function of the right hemisphere enables us to unify the words we perceive into phrases, these into sentences, and so on into larger units that we will be able to comprehend what has been spoken or thought. The acts of speaking and verbal thinking are processes that occur in a series of steps, one at a time. The understanding of what is thought and said is a process that occurs in one step. Since the acts of speaking and verbal thinking are processes that occur at separate points in time, they are therefore carried out by the left hemisphere, which is in charge of all processes of segregation and differentiation. Conversely, the act of extracting the significance from a series of related units, which is carried out in one step, is under the jurisdiction of the right hemisphere, which is in charge of all functions of unification and integration. In summary, let's note that the left hemisphere of the brain is in charge of noting the differences between things, separating wholes into parts, and enabling us to deal with all sequential phenomena, wholes presented pieces at a time. This mode of thinking is popularly known as analytical, Cartesian, serial, linear, deductive, segregative, etc. The right side is in charge of noting the similarities between things and their relation to each other and the whole, thus unifying them. This mode of thinking is generally known as synthetical, holistic, congregative, etc. We must also note that the left side of the brain is extroverted and is therefore the means for their outer culture noted above. The right side is introverted and is the means for the inner culture. Although both functions are complementary, that is, their equal inputs are needed for every mental activity to be complete, most people have a predominance of one over the other. We all know too well of people who can generate a profusion of words, yet make little sense, or go off on tangents, etc. Too much left and too little right. On the other hand, we know of people who are not very expressive verbally, in fact, are poor communicators, yet are profound. Critical to this book is the fact that these hemispheric differences are not randomly distributed through society. Men in general are more left-sided than women, and so are members of the white race in comparison to non-whites, a well-known fact to Western psychologists. We will come to learn that hemispheric differences are shaping forces of cultural differences, and the historical events that such differences have engendered. In fact, without this concept, there can be no science of history or psychology or anthropology or understanding of religion. The differences in thought patterns between the white and black races are well known. To prove this point, I will quote from well-established scholars. Writing about the Bantus of South Africa, Placide Temples, at the turn of the century, states in his Bantu philosophy that, quote, this European concept of separate beings, of substance, to use the scholastic term again, which find themselves side by side, entirely independent one of another, is foreign to Bantu thought. Bantu hold that created beings preserve a bond one with another, an intimate ontological relationship, comparable with the causal tie which bonds creature and creator. Just as Bantu ontology is opposed to the European concept of individuated things existing in themselves isolated from others, so Bantu psychology cannot conceive of man as an individual, as a force existing by itself and apart from its ontological relationships with other living beings and from its connection with animals or intimate forces around it. Writing about the same people, Jan Heinz Jan states in Muntu, when we say that the traditional African view of the world is one of extraordinary harmony, then, except for the word African, every single word in the sentence is both right and wrong. For in the first place, the traditional worldview is still alive today. Secondly, it is a question not of a worldview in the European sense, since things that are contemplated, experienced, and lived are not separable in it. Thirdly, it can be called extraordinary only in the European sense, while for the African it is entirely commonplace. And fourth, the expression harmony is entirely inadequate, since it does not indicate what parts are being harmonized in what whole. And if we say everything is harmonized, that tells us less than ever. Jan then quotes Adebayo Adesanya, a Yoruba writer. This is not simply a coherence of fact and faith, nor of reason and traditional beliefs, nor of reason and contingent facts, but a coherence or compatibility among all disciplines. A medical theory, e.g., which contradicted a theological conclusion, was rejected as absurd, and vice versa. This demand of mutual compatibility among all disciplines considered as a system was the main weapon of Yoruba thinking. God might be banished from Greek thought without any harm being done to the logical architecture of it, but this cannot be done in the case of Yoruba. In medieval thought, science could be dismissed at pleasure, but this is impossible in the case of Yoruba, since faith and reason are mutually dependent. In modern times, God even has no place in scientific thinking. This was impossible to the Yoruba. These observations extend to all contemporary Africans as well as ancient. A. Barb, writing in the Legacy of Egypt, states the following. Certainly scholars have since provided dictionaries and grammars of the ancient Egyptian language, but that is not enough to grasp the Egyptian way of thinking, so utterly different from our Western logical mind. There is first of all what has been called the multiplicity of approaches, statements, and answers to problems, which to us would seem absolutely contradictory, appear side by side, and did not in the least disturb the Egyptian. On the contrary, our own logical abstractions would probably have appeared to the Egyptian mind as an impoverishment and falsification of the fullness of significant truth. All this would lead, as a modern scholar has put it, to the impossibility of translating Egyptian thoughts into modern language, for the distinctions we cannot avoid making did not exist for the Egyptians. In speaking of the Greeks and Romans regarding their ability to comprehend Egyptian beliefs, Wallace Budge in The Gods of the Egyptians, Volume 1 states, the evidence on the subject now available indicates that he, the Greeks, was racially incapable of appreciating the importance of such beliefs to those who held them, and that although, as in the case of the Ptolemies, he was ready to tolerate and even for state purposes to adopt them, it was impossible for him to absorb them into his life. It is important to note that these observations on the differences in thinking between whites and blacks were all made before the appearance of literature concerning the cerebral hemispheres. I could have piled up enough evidence on the subject to fill this book, but the foregoing should prove the point. The consensus of the differences between these two modes of thinking is that they each represent by and of themselves legitimate approaches, schools of thought to knowing. On one hand, this belief must be rejected on the ground that the two are complementary to each other. They are incomplete by themselves. On the other hand, we will see, as history records, that the evils arising from the unbalanced expressions of the left hemisphere far exceed in destructiveness those of the right hemisphere. While the former is responsible primarily for man's inhumanity to man and all social disharmony, the latter is responsible for stagnation in physical technology. The greatest problem arises from the fact that the greatest validators of our actions, i.e. religion and science, which are intrinsic products of right-sided cultures, are now used by predominantly left-sided cultures in the characteristic fashion of the left hemisphere. Although the left side is totally incapable of truly religious and scientific thinking, the grafting of its processes onto these subjects has gone unnoticed, due on one hand to ignorance and on the other to the military supremacy acquired by Europeans in the last 2,000 years. The results have been that scientific and religious validation has been given to false doctrines, practices, and institutions that now control the cultures of the nations dominating the world, and set the cultural trends for the others. It is important to see how this has come about. A brief definition of religion. An analysis of the word religion shows that it is to the right side of the brain what a glove is to the hand. The word is composed of the Latin prefix re, meaning again, back, plus legere, meaning tie, bind, fasten, as well as the Indo-European root leg, meaning to collect, from whence the Greek legein, and the Latin legere, meaning logic and legal. From this we can conclude that the coiners of the word religion applied it to those beliefs and practices aimed at tying people back to something with which they had originally been one and belong with by natural connectivity. The original oneness is implied by the prefix re, back again, and the natural connectivity is explicit in the root meaning law and logic. Right at the outset, we can see that in the meaning of the word itself, according to its components, religion was not thought to be opposed to reason and logics, which are the foundations of science and philosophy. More on this later. We have seen that the predominant function of the right side of the brain is a unifying or collecting or synthesizing one. Religion is therefore nothing more than one of its organized expressions. Its concern with realities existing beyond the visible is a further proof of its intrinsic relationship to the right hemisphere. We can thus conclude that all efforts by left-sided cultures that are aimed at creating religious doctrines and practices must produce results off the expected mark. Western religions are good examples. We will see that the Hebraic and Christian religions are hybrids resulting from the juxtaposition of a left hemispheric thought process upon religious doctrines created by right or balanced hemispheric cultures. The same can be said for Hinduism and Islam, although they have maintained a greater faithfulness to the fundamental culture upon which they are based. During the first 2,000 years of history, 4000 to 2000 BC, the only nations that attained to a high degree of civilization were Kemet, ancient Egypt, Sumer, Babylon, Canaan, Harappa Valley, and Kush, Ethiopia. Although it is well known to all serious historians that all these nations were black, to this day much effort is being made to hide the fact from the general population. With some it is due to racism. With others, it is due to feelings of shame over the fact that throughout the first 4,000 years of history, it is well known that Western people had attained to very little cultural development, as well as the fact that they are indebted to the above black nations for the foundation of their scientific, religious, and philosophical accomplishments. They repaid these nations by utterly destroying their civilizations and enslaving their descendants. And with others, it is because they took the traditions of these black nations, added a few touches here and there to make it more in keeping with some of their social values, and then claimed that the final product was a revelation from God to them. Religion, trance, and ancestors. As religion concerns itself with the inner realm of being, its main vehicle is the phenomenon of trance. Proficiency in this state, which we will later define, gives one full acquaintance with the metaphysical realm. On one hand, communication with the two classes of entities dwelling therein, the dead, ancestors, and the spirits administering natural phenomena, angels, deities, becomes possible. On the other hand, first-hand knowledge of man's metaphysical vehicles and the experience of man's true relation with God and all other creatures are attained. The central theme of this discourse becomes clear when we take note of the fact that while Westerners believe in the survival of the spirit after death, they have no tradition of ancestor worship, i.e. communication with the deceased. Now the reason is clear. It is for lack of a culture of trance working, which is the only means to that end. The same holds true for angels. While Western religions claim belief in their existence, these metaphysical dwellers have been banished of late to the pages of the scriptures. The ability through trance to communicate with deceased beings has led blacks to the greatest understanding of the nature of man. It has provided us with an inner empirical evidence of the immortality of man. Immortality is not merely the survival of the spirit, but of one's identity across incarnations. On one hand, because of the pricelessness of the revelation that man is immortal, and on the other hand, because of the unparalleled guidance that ancestors provide. Rituals for communion with the ancestors, so-called ancestor worship, play a prominent role in the religion of black nations. It is instructive to note that the greatest architectural marvels of the ancient civilizations, Kemet, Mohenjo-Daro, etc., were burial shrines. Entire cities were filled with these structures, pyramids, etc., that surpassed in opulence the dwellings of even the kings. In place of this insight, Western scholars could only see what they believed to be the work of megalomaniacal builders. Only from the ancestors, the, quote, living proof of life after death, could have been learned the observances and practices that lead to immortality, the survival of an individual's identity across incarnations. Such practices and observances became the fundamental doctrines for the spiritual development of men and nations. Participation in a series of African and Oriental rituals will reveal to all that women in general can attain to the trance state with greater ease and power than men. Societies that have a deep appreciation for synthetical thinking and introversion due to their right-sidedness or equilibration cannot fail then to hold in great esteem their women. Just the opposite is found in left-sided societies. It is no wonder then to find that in all black nations, not led astray by whites, women and goddesses occupy positions and play roles equaling those of the males. Women in Kemet and other black nations of antiquity occupied positions not yet achieved by Western women to date. As queen mothers, they determined the transference of the kingship and legitimized the king. Inheritance was through them. That is, they held the wealth of the nation. They were priestesses in their own right, and it is a matter of record that the goddesses whose shrines they were responsible for commanded greater importance than those of the gods in many cases. In contrast, we find Western women just beginning to make headway in their struggle for equality, 6,000 years behind their black counterparts. Where is the female rabbi, imam, bishop, etc.? To summarize, I would like to point to the fact that what I have done is simply carry to the logical conclusion well-known facts regarding the division of the brain's function. It was not until the early part of the 1950s that Western scientists began to understand fully that the higher functions of the human brain were divided between hemispheres. Teams of surgeons, psychologists, neurologists, and biologists discovered that the two hemispheres process information regarding the same things in diametrically opposed yet complementary ways. Unfortunately, Western scientists went on to characterize the separate functions of each hemisphere by wild generalizations. The left side governs language, scientific thinking, etc., for example. Even wilder generalizations were given. The left and the right hemispheres, respectively, were said to differ from each other in that the first is intellectual, the other intuitive. Intellectual versus sensuous, secondary versus primary. Freud, deductive versus imaginative, realistic versus impulsive, analytic versus relational, sequential versus multiple, rational versus intuitive, discursive versus eidetic, etc. There is a bit of truth in some of these statements, but they cannot be accepted without due caution and corrections. We will deal with them in later chapters. It has also been recognized that in some people the functions of the left hemisphere predominate, while in others those of the right do. Central to our discourse is the fact that the characteristics of Western culture are predominantly the productions of the left hemisphere of the brain, while the characteristics of black and most other non-Western cultures are that of the right. Let's return to the earlier quotation from Placide Temple's book. Quote, "This European concept of separate beings or substance which find themselves side by side, entirely independent one of another, is foreign to Bantu thought." This observation, which is one of thousands, implicitly but unequivocally states that something in the European makes them quote-unquote see and postulate differences, while something in the Bantu, as well as other Africans, which includes the ancient Egyptians, makes them see and postulate unity when viewing the same reality. Again, in The Legacy of Egypt, Barb states that although Westerners are now in possession of dictionaries and grammars of the Egyptian language, they are not in a position to understand it because, quote, "the Egyptian way of thinking so utterly different from our Western logical mind," end quote. Again, one has to be obtuse not to see that what Barb refers to as the European logical mind is the predominance of the left side of the brain, Of course, the statement must be corrected to syllogistic logic, for the right side has a logical function of its own. Barb concludes by referring to the impossibility of translating Egyptian thoughts into modern language, for the distinctions we cannot avoid making did not exist for the Egyptians. It begs several questions. Why can't European thinking avoid making distinctions that do not exist for the Egyptians? Or, equally valid, why cannot the Egyptians avoid unifying and synthesizing where Westerners cannot avoid segregating and analyzing? Before we answer these questions, let's dispose of the racist statement, modern. It is a tool of the theory of evolutionism that holds that the black races and their cultural expressions exemplify the primitive phase of mankind, while the white race represent the more evolved, modern. The observation made by many scholars concerning the difference in thinking between African people and Westerners can only be intelligently explained by reference to the hemispheres of the brain. If the cultural expressions of the individual nations of an entire race share the same trait, analytical for example, it can only be because their thinking is dominated by the left hemisphere. Fortunately, we don't have to speculate on the issue for the simple fact that it is well known by professionals in the area. Western scientists have long arrived at the conclusion that Western culture is predominantly left-sided, and is now attempting very strongly to introduce into the school system methods that will make more use of the right hemisphere. This has been especially encouraged by the discovery that such educational methods that appeal to the right side of the brain excel greatly over those of the left. Quote-unquote super learning, accelerated learning, etc. are the superlatives that are being thrown around as they are finding that such methods shorten the learning period 2 to 20 times faster and produce a greater yield in understanding and retention, 500% in the same time span over the left side. Is this the reason why black nations were the first to achieve a high level of civilization? We will see that it is. The techniques used in the current super learning systems are nothing more than a minor fraction of the techniques used in traditional Africa from time immemorial. By pretending that the whole thing is a recent Western discovery and invention, Westerners are dooming themselves to stagnation again. They need to humbly ask the African people to show them the way. A study of the literature on brain hemispheres will show that analytical and segregative thinking are carried out by the left hemisphere, while synthetical thinking is done by the right side. Let's put it another way. The left side is responsible for the differences we make between things. It is the author, for example, of the Western attitude of seeing themselves as being separate from nature and therefore ruining the ecological balance, killing off whole species of animals, polluting the air, soil, etc., of denying diet a significant role in healing. Poisons play a higher role, of racial and sexual discrimination, and so forth. On the other hand, the ecological mindfulness of most other non-Western people, for example, must be attributed to the dominance of the right hemisphere in their thinking. The respect and high regard for their women is the result of the same function. A most important expression of the right side of the brain concerns the non-Western belief in the indivisibility between all things in the world. Far from being a mere intellectual notion, it is the basis of their entire way of life. Affect one thing, and all others are. The Western man's response to this is to call it primitive animism. Fortunately, it is just a word without objective reality. But is this not the foundation of religion? To tie, legion, back, the things that have been separated. Unity states the Kabbalah is the foundation of good, while disunity is the foundation of evil. Egotism, a failure to experience the interdependence between humans, is a function of the left side and a major problem that religion sees as a chief obstacle to the spiritual life. We will see that the cure for egotism is the activation of the right side of the brain. We also will see that the religions of black nations were well acquainted with the dualization, the knowledge of good and evil, of the spirit, and made its unification the foundation of their spiritual tradition. What today the Western man calls the functions of the hemispheres of the brain, the Khemetic referred to as the two truths, Mati, Taui, the Taoist as the doctrine of yin and yang, the Dogons as the twin pneumo serpents that govern the various aspects of the world. Finally, we must note that racial differences go beyond the color of the skin, type of hair, skeletal structure, and other physiognomical items. In future chapters, we will accumulate all the evidence to show that there is a cultural unity among all white nations, all black nations, and all Oriental nations, and that the common factors in each are traceable to the hemisphere of the brain that dominates their thinking, their language, and cultural expressions. And finally, that since the behavior of nations is a product of this part of their biological makeup, they could hardly help the manner in which they created their cultural expressions and reacted to others, determining thus the events that make up world history. This, and only this, I dare say, can establish history and anthropology as sciences, as well as to put the study of religion on a scientific basis. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Black Founders of Civilization. In the preceding chapter, we saw that one of the main factors that is responsible for the differences in cultural expressions is the division of the brain into two hemispheres, each with its own peculiar way of thinking. We were able to go beyond a mere listing of the cultural traits of nations and to catalog them into two fundamental sets based on the traits of each of the hemispheres of the brain, i.e., if it is not shown why, it is of no use to say that the fundamental traits of black cultures are the burial of the dead, especially accompanied by grave offerings, and communication with ancestors, high recognition of women, matrilocal marriages, matriarchal inheritance system, etc., and female divine powers, high degree of social stratification, high degree of stratification of the, quote, celestial hierarchy of powers controlling events on earth, and the involvement of religion in every area of life. We saw how these are all results of a people's mental output dominated by the side of the brain whose strong point is trance. White culture, which is extroverted, left hemispheric, produced and sustains a culture that, before contact with blacks, cremated its dead or exposed them to be eaten by animals, and has a negative attitude toward and horror of spirits of the dead to this day, holds its women and, quote, female divine powers in low esteem. The Christian divine pantheon is made of a father, a son, and a ghost, for example. Low degree of social stratification, and the love of freedom from authority that goes with it, laissez-faire. Separation of religion from all other social institutions, government, education, etc., and the restriction of the divine to special places and times, church, Sunday, holidays, etc. The separation of divine from healing, and so on. If you can't help thinking this way, it's because the left side of the brain is dominating your thinking. Keeping these ideas firmly in awareness, let's attempt to establish the racial characteristics of certain nations of antiquity. The importance of knowing the racial identity of the nations that were the founders of civilization lies in the fact that 1. Religious doctrines and systems cannot be understood in a vacuum. They cannot be separated from the social environment that produced them. The various components of the religious system of each nation are, for example, ritual vehicles to condition the population to support or reject particulars of interest or detriment to the nation. The ritual system of Osiris, will always remain a mystery to people who have no understanding of the African kingship and the history of the peculiar difficulties that the Commissions experienced with their kingship. In the same way, people who know little regarding the African queen mothership and high priestessship, e.g. the rituals performed with the skeletal remains of deceased kings, will understand little regarding the ritual system of Osset, Isis. 2. The white nations who became the heirs of these civilizations understood only the external aspects, would appeal to the left side of the brain, and distorted the spiritual, internal right-brained. What passes for the world's major religions are attempts of the left side of the brain to practice what can only be done by the right side. Can you imagine where chemistry would be today if it were in the hands of poets? Right-sided function? Each element would no longer be a complex of exact weight and electrical behavior, but gray clouds or wolves, according to the poet's mood. This is what the sons of Eurasia have done to the science of religion. The result is that with the destruction of the ancient black founders of civilization, some 4,000 to 2,000 years ago, the world has been plunged into a spiritual dark age and is sinking ever into that jaw whose fiery tongue flickers with death. 3. The solution to our problem is the restitution of the science of life that actually gave birth to civilization. The only way that this can be done is by correlating the spiritual doctrines and religious practices of the founding civilizations with those of the black civilizations of today. This is of extreme importance for the simple fact that most students of spiritual culture and esotericism have received their education from Western organizations, Rosicrucians, Aryan Hindus, Semitic and European Kabbalists, etc., who have falsely claimed that they are the custodians of the wisdom of the ancients. After going through this book, the reader can decide if this is true. Last but not least, we come to understand that religion cannot save mankind unless it is allowed to govern all social institutions. All such teachings regarding the lone sage and individual salvation will be seen to be, on one hand, natural conceptions of the left side of the brain with its isolationist thinking, and on the other, to be impotent as far as being vehicles for the spiritual upliftment of the world. In our study, we will see that when the white nations adopted the religious institutions of the blacks, they allowed only those doctrines that did not interfere, for the most part, with their most cherished social beliefs, whether these were right or wrong. In fact, many of the religious myths and doctrines have their origin in the political competition that arose out of their contacts with blacks. The extreme manner in which women were humiliated made the source of all mankind's suffering. The heavily lopsided adultery laws against them, etc., in Semitic Asia 4,000 years ago, for example, was chiefly due to the fact that the occupation of very high positions of the black women of Canaan, Sumer, Phoenicia, etc., was a serious challenge to the patriarchal system of the whites, as it has filled the heads of their women with another view of social possibilities. In those days, The white people of Mesopotamia were under the cultural, if not political, dominion of blacks. Establishing the racial identity of the founders of civilization is a simple matter. Yet the issue needs to be heavily detailed so that there is no room for doubt. Western writers have tried so hard to hide the fact of the blackness of these civilizations that their culture is so distorted and misunderstood, and their descendants, modern-day blacks, have been totally, culturally disenfranchised. The three fundamental races of mankind and the principle of geographic contiguity. If we put the variation and admixtures aside, then we find that the races of mankind are the white, the black, and the yellow, red, oriental, which includes the American Indian. When we trace these people back to late prehistoric and early historic times, we find that each of these people reside in separate geographic locations. The Oriental in the northeasternmost part of Asia and later America, the Eurasian, white, in the northwesternmost part of Asia and northern Europe, and the blacks, occupying from the southern parts of Europe, western and central Asia, and all of Africa. Within each of these three great geographical divisions of the world, we find, in late prehistoric and early historic times, before the great migrations of people, nations speaking related languages with similar racial characteristics and cultural patterns. We could say that the Supreme Being made men with certain differences and put them in different parts of the globe. Western historians have used these concepts to discover the kinship and origin of their people after thousands of years of separation. When it comes to the great black civilizations, it is a different story. Western historians are always postulating an unproven and unprovable geographic origin for them in areas where they have no kin, i.e., they seek the origins of the Sumerians in Eastern Asia, when the people who most closely share their racial and cultural characteristics reside in Africa. They do the same for the ancient Egyptians. The exact locations of the origin of many of the great white nations of antiquity are unknown. Yet, no historian has proposed an origin for them in America or Africa. It is such a natural reflex to search for their origins in the geographic location where all whites have been known to inhabit since prehistoric times. We must take note of the fact that plants and animals of related characteristics have been thus distributed around the earth. Trick number 2 has been to postulate that the precocious development of Khemetic, ancient Egyptian culture, was either the product of an invading, quote, master white Semitic race, the Shemzu Heru, or the result of the blending of the white and the black races. First of all, it is important to realize that at work is the racist offshoot ideas of Darwinism. To wit, clearly, blacks, a primitive race, could not solely or primarily be responsible for a culture. Period. Rather than pass in deserved silence the allegation that a white race was responsible for Khemetic civilization, wholly or in part, let's look at some facts. 1. No facts have ever been given to support the allegation, showing that the concept is born solely from the unwillingness to accept the fact that blacks could have created such a civilization. 2. This alleged master, quote, white race has no other achievement, previous or otherwise. They left no traces of civilization anywhere else. At the time when this alleged dynastic race is supposed to have come to Kemet and placed themselves under the military leadership of the Khemetic leader Narmer, Eurasia was still in the Paleolithic stage, hunter-gatherer around 3500 BC, while all of North Africa was in the Neolithic and early agricultural stage, and Kemet had passed into the historical stage. The proposal that they came from Arabia is even worse. At that time, Arabia was mostly inhabited by blacks who were less developed regarding civilization. Thus, we are to believe that a people who achieved nothing at home came and established civilization in an entirely more advanced area, and then vanished, leaving no remains of themselves, no bones, cultural items, likeness of themselves in paintings, sculptures, etc. In reality, the Shem-Su-Heru, the people who historians have tried to equate with their hypothetical race, are the very blacks that are called Nubians. What can you say of historians who ignore the fact that all the nations in the northeastern section of Africa at that time were far ahead of Eurasia in the technologies that were chiefly responsible for the development of Kemet, and who preferred to invent a Eurasian cause for the development of Comitian civilization? An important part of this argument rests on the false theory that racial contact is the chief cause for the advancement of civilization. Let's look at the facts. A. The Hyksos occupation of Kemet for 150 years contributed nothing to the progress of Comitian culture. In fact, all historians are in agreement that it retarded it. So did the occupation of Kemet by the Persians, Greeks, and Romans. In fact, the contact of whites with the Comitian culture ended in the destruction of the latter, culturally and physically. I cannot imagine one single historian who would not agree that the civilizations of ancient Egypt, Sumer, Indus Valley, and Kush would far surpass anything in the present world had they not been destroyed by whites. It is a very interesting subject to speculate upon. B. The same retardation, arrest of progress, and eventual destruction occurred with the mingling of white culture with that of Sumer, Canaan, Phoenicia, Indus Valley. C. The theory has only held true in the reverse direction, as Western man greatly benefited from his contact with the ancient black civilizations. The point of this detailed look at the issue is not merely to prove historians wrong, but to emphasize the real source of civilization. Today's leading psychologists will tell you that when you have to come up with the solution of a problem for which there are no precedents, it's to the right side of the brain that you have to make your appeal. It is in charge of invention and creativity. The progress of Western science is more one of technological advancement and variation than of invention without precedents. To this day, no one has explained how the Chinese were able to come so far in science since the end of World War II. They have done in less than 40 years what normally takes over 150 years for Europeans. We will see that the Chinese is an eminently right-sided culture. The ability of the great black nations to invent civilization and make such rapid progress must be seen as the result of their advanced techniques for using the right side of the brain. In fact, Kemet outdistanced Sumer, Canaan, the Indus Valley, and Phoenicia because it adhered closely to a right-side methodology of thinking, in which his hieroglyphic system played a pivotal role. The third ruse used by historians is an insult to their intelligence. It concerns their play with the word Ham. In the Old Testament, the races of mankind are classified as descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. While it is accepted by all that Japheth corresponds to the European and Northern Asiatics, and Shem to the Semites, there is a great deal of, well, you would have to call it, idiotic talk regarding Ham. Since there are no Oriental people depicted in the paintings and sculptures of Kemet, Greece, and Mesopotamian nations, it is not far-fetched to conclude that the compilers of the Old Testament were not familiar with this race, especially given the fact that they were located so far away. This explains why the Orientals were not included among the races of mankind. Now we know that the biblical compilers were very well acquainted with black people. After all, their ancestors were heavily intermarried with them, to say the least. Now, if the Semites correspond to Shem, the European to Japheth, then where do we assign the blacks? Still don't know? Let's modify the question. If Ham does not correspond to the Semites or the Europeans or the Orientals, to whom does it correspond? The Old Testament compilers assigned Ham to ancient Egypt, Canaan, Cush, Ethiopia, and Punt, a nation that was located at the Horn of Africa, modern-day Somaliland. The ancient Egyptians claimed that it was the location of their origin, hence made regular pilgrimages to it. They called it Metu Neter, land of God. Incidentally, the people of this area dressed in the same fashion as that of the Egyptians, and their men styled their beard in the same manner as the false beard worn by the Khemetic pharaoh. These similarities clearly support the Khemetic claim that they descended not only from this area but from these people, and through Cush, Ethiopia, Ham relates to the indigenous original inhabitants of Arabia and Sumer, which last was referred to as Nimrod, ruler of Babel, Erech, and Akkad in the land of Shinar, Sumer, according to the biblical Table of Nations. Hebrew scholars claim that the etymology and meaning of the word Ham is uncertain. We will see that this is the case with many of the most important words in the Hebrew language, and why. Now the word is actually pronounced Kam, as it is spelled with the guttural H, Cheth, or Keth. The popular pronunciation with the aspirated H is the product of sloppy scholasticism. It is a loan word from the ancient Egyptian language, where it means black. And the ancient Egyptians called their country Khemetic, land of the blacks, and themselves Kamu, black people. This can explain why, of all races, the black has been referred to since ancient times by the color of their skin. Negroes, from the Latin negro, meaning black. If it were natural to do so, we would find that other people would be referred to in a similar manner. Instead, all other people of antiquity are referred to by the name of their nation. White people call blacks black because the Khemetic people started the whole thing by thus calling themselves. Their paintings and sculptures of themselves testify to the fact that they were of the black Negro race, and so are the words of foreign eyewitnesses. Herodotus, the eminent Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BC, describes the Khemetic people as having, quote, black skins and woolly hair. In Eternal Egypt, Pierre Montet describes the Khemeticians, ancient Egyptians, as follows, quote, they had clearly defined features, prominent eyes, usually large, almost flat noses, thickish lips, and somewhat low foreheads. Such were without exception the kings of Egypt at the time of the Old Kingdom. Many individuals presented the same features. For instance, Ranifer, who lived during the 5th dynasty, of whom there are 2 statues in the Cairo Museum, end quote. It is interesting to note that Montet fails to sum up these characteristics as black, especially when he has seen the statue of the priest Ranifer, which is indisputably that of a so-called Negro. So desperate have historians become that in their attempts to identify Ham with another race, perhaps Martian will qualify, they have classified most Nilotic blacks, like the Maasai and the Somali, as non-Negroes. Yet they are Hamitic. Interestingly, the same historians label the same blacks as Negroes when they are referring to them during the Egyptian historical period. So how come today they are of the so-called non-black Hamitic or Nilotic race, a race unknown by scientists? The answer is to be seen in the fact that more and more evidence is pouring in showing that the ancient Egyptians and the contemporary Negroes of the Sudan, the Gala, Barai, Dinka, Nuer, etc., and northeastern Africa are linguistically related. To show that Kemet is ethnically and culturally related to Africa, Frankfurt wrote of several of the earlier African prehistoric cultures of the Sudan south of Egypt. Together, they represent the African substratum of pharaonic civilization, the material counterpart of the affinities between ancient Egyptian and modern Hamitic languages, of the physical resemblances between the ancient Egyptians and the modern Hamites, and the remarkable similarities in mentality between these two groups, which makes it possible to understand ancient Egyptian customs and beliefs by reference to modern Hamitic analogies. The First Great Civilizations, page 46, Takeda Hawks. In the Symposium on the Peopling of Ancient Egypt and the Deciphering of Meroitic Script, January 28, 1974, published in 1978 by the UNESCO, Theophile Obenga introduced the irrefutable evidence that the ancient Egyptian language and its descendant, the Coptic language used by the Coptic Church, are related to the African languages. He proved the point by giving a substantial list of words that are common in meaning as well as grammatical functions to the Commission, Coptic, and modern Negro-African languages, i.e., he used the same principles that proved the unity of the languages that are classified as Indo-European Iranian. A very important aspect of the Commission language that I am sure Egyptologists must have noted but have kept silent is the widespread occurrence of words that are written in the same manner but differ totally in meaning. They have kept silent about this because it irrefutably ties Kemet to the rest of Africa. For example, the Commission word ow has the following meanings: grave, tomb, to come, sleep, slumber, to punish, to do harm, to bespatter, to make, a charge against, foreign interpreter. In every case, the word is written with the same letters, while the reader distinguishes the meaning from the added hieroglyphic symbolic determinant. The only way that speakers, listeners, could do the same would be through variations of intonation and accents. For example, in the Twi language of the Akans of West Africa, Meba means my son, when the ba is accented, and I am going, when the mi is accented. In the Chinese language, which exhibits the same principle, the word shi means damp stone, to cause, and to be when pronounced in an even pitch, rising pitch, dropping, then rising pitch, and dropping pitch, respectively. The only way that Commission speakers could use the word ow to mean so many things would be by such intonation differences. It must be noted that this phenomenon is widespread in all African languages and is the main problem in the creation of alphabetical systems for recording these languages. This is one of the reasons why the Commissions never abandoned their hieroglyphic system, a fact that historians to this day cannot understand. Their chief explanation relies on the racist Darwinist theory of linguistic evolution, which explains hieroglyphic writing as the primitive expressions of man's efforts to write. Incidentally, this linguistic phenomenon is what gives the Oriental and African dictions their characteristic sing-song pattern. Studies on the hemispheres of the brain have shown that this melodic superimposition on speech in relation to meaning is due to the right side of the brain. This ties in with my premise relating the black and Oriental races to the right side of the brain. This pattern is virtually foreign to the diction of Western men and poses a great barrier to their learning these languages. Perhaps the real source of the Khemetic problem is to be sought in Canaan. Thus far, it seems that historians are getting away with making it a white and Semitic nation. The basic argument is that the Old Testament compilers believed that it was Hamitic because it had extensive economic and cultural dealings with Kemet. Jewish scholars know better. In their later religious text commenting on the OT, we find the following. Quote, others say that Ham himself, unmanned, castrated Noah, who, awakening from his drunken sleep and understanding what had been done to him, cried, now I cannot beget the fourth son whose children I would have ordered to serve you and your brothers. Therefore it must be Canaan, your firstborn, who they enslave. And since you have disabled me from doing ugly things in the blackness of night, Canaan's children shall be born ugly and black. Moreover, because you twisted your head around to see my nakedness, your grandchildren's hair shall be twisted into kinks, and their eyes red. Again, because your lips jested at my misfortune, theirs shall swell, and because you neglected my nakedness, they shall go naked, and their male members shall be shamefully elongated. Men of this race are called Negroes. Their forefather Canaan commanded them to love theft and fornication, to be banded together in hatred of their masters, and never to tell the truth. This quotation was taken from Hebrew Myths by Graves and Patai. It cites the following Jewish religious text as the original sources: B. Sanhedrin 72a-b, 108b, B. Pesahim 113b, Tanhuma Buber, Genesis 49:50, Tanhuma Noah 13:15, and Rab 341. The above is one of many rabbinical texts created for the purpose of, quote, clearing up difficult biblical passages in order to justify taking the land of Palestine from its original inhabitants, the Canaanites. Genesis states that Canaan shall bear the curse of perpetual slavery to the Semites and Europeans for the, quote, sin committed by his father Ham. Accordingly, Ham committed an injustice against his father Noah by walking into the latter's tent, unknowing of the fact that the latter was drunk and naked. Later, rabbis were uncomfortable with the passage on one hand because they could not justify the rationale for charging Ham with the crime and the punishment, sentencing his descendant to eternal enslavement, cannot stand up to a common sense of justice. On the other hand, they knew that the story was an adaptation of the well-known Middle Eastern mythical theme of the father's castration by his sons. It occurs with the Greeks in the story of Kronos' castration of his father Uranus in order to usurp his power. The Hebrew version is most likely derived from the Hittite myth, derived from the Hurrians, in which the supreme god Anu curses his son and cupbearer Kumarbi because the latter bit off his genitals, who afterwards rejoiced and laughed as Ham was supposed to have done. I trace the version of the story to the Hittites because the Hebrew people originated ethnically from a mixture of Hittites, Amorites, and blacks. Their language and religion is an adaptation of the Canaanite tradition, which is black. That the Jews got their language and religion from the Canaanites and Sumerians through Babylon is well documented by historians. If the preceding is not convincing enough, let's quote the Babylonian Talmud, translated or edited by Rabbi Dr. I. Epstein, Sanhedrin, Volume 2, pages 608 and 609. Quote, "For when the Africans came to plead against the Jews before Alexander of Macedonia, they said, Canaan belongs to us, as it is written, the land of Canaan, with the coast thereof. And Canaan was the ancestors of these people." Here we find a Jewish rabbi dealing with historical records of Babylonian historians who were eyewitnesses to the historical life of Canaan, calling its inhabitants Africans, as the latter called themselves. The event described above occurred around 332 BC, when Alexander took Palestine away from the Jews, who had initially taken it away from the Canaanites. Incidentally, the taking of Palestine from the Canaanites by the Jews is the pivotal theme of the Old Testament, the Hebrews' quest for a land of their own. Because of the Jewish involvement in the history of Canaan, I cite their references as the most authoritative regarding the racial identity of the people of Canaan. This fact must be extended to embrace Phoenicia, which was merely one of the cities of Canaan. It is very important to take note of the fact that racially speaking, the Semitic people originate from the same stock as the European. They were the first of the Eurasians to migrate from the north, around 3000 BC, into Western Asia. There they became politically and culturally subjected to the blacks, Sumerians, Canaanites, Phoenicians, etc., who were far ahead of them in civilization. Having adopted the culture and language of the latter, they practically lost the knowledge of their original tongue and most of their culture, as has happened to blacks in America. The main stock of these people must be traced to the Amorites, Martu, Amu, and Amuru, and Hittites. The Amorites, as known from Khemetic paintings as the Amu, and other sources, are tall, fair, blue-eyed, some are blondes and others brown-haired. The Hittites appear in history as an essentially white people slightly mixed with black and oriental, as they are depicted in their own sculptures and Khemetic paintings. They cannot be told apart from modern-day Persians and Armenians. The language of the Hittites was related to the Latin and Celtic, which may account for the guttural element in Semitic speech. Once these people were assimilated culturally by the blacks of Western Asia, they lost their language, but not their speech articulation pattern, as has happened to blacks in the West Indies and America. For certain, we know that the Hebrews were a mixture of Hittites and Amorites and Canaanites. In Ezekiel 16:3, we read of the Jews saying about themselves, quote, "And say, Thus saith the Lord God unto Jerusalem, Thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan. Thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother a Hittite." Why cannot we conclude that the guttural element of Hebraic speech came from the Indo-European language of the Hittites? Additionally, the terms Hebrew and Arab were derived from their common ancestor, Eber, who was the grandson of Arphaxad, who was a direct descendant from Shem. But Arphaxad is a good Indo-Iranian name. I relate it to the Medians. My argument is finally strengthened by the fact that it should strike anyone as a great oddity that studies of the Semitic languages, which were written down long before that of the Indo-Europeans, and thus stabilized, have yielded no common parent before they were separated, has been done for Indo-European. Before commenting on this, let's take note of the fact that while the languages of the Indo-Europeans, Africans, and Orientals number over 100, each with hundreds of dialects, they are, with generous concessions, only 3 Semitic languages, with no more than 4 dialects. They are 1. Akkadian and its dialects, Babylonian and Assyrian, 2. Aramaic and its dialect, Hebrew, and 3. Arabic. The reason for this is that the Semitic languages are really variants of essentially black languages of Canaan, Phoenicia. Therefore, any attempt to find the original Semitic language must lead back to Canaan, Phoenicia. In fact, this study has been done, but it is suppressed by mere silence on one hand, and on the other by passing Canaan and Phoenicia as Semites. We will see that in their mode of thinking, and therefore in their cultural expression, they share everything in common with the rest of Africa. The conclusion is inescapable. There is no such reality as a Semitic language. What we call Semitic languages are really dialectical variants of African Hamitic languages. Let's quote a highly regarded Jewish author and professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. Ancient Judaism by Irving M. Zeitlin, Polity Press. On page 19, we read concerning Israel's debt to Canaan. Canaanite influence on ancient Israel. What the Raz Shamra evidence shows beyond doubt is that the Canaanites did, in fact, have an influence upon the culture of Israel. The only question is not whether such an influence existed, but rather its nature and how and when it occurred. Beginning with the biblical literature, it is evidence that they are perfected and polished writings, attesting to the existence of literary traditions going back many centuries. These traditions are neither Mesopotamian nor Egyptian, but Canaanite. Just as the Hebrew language developed from Canaanite, so Hebrew literature built on the Canaanite literary traditions, which had crystallized long before the Israelites had become a people. Israel took over norms and techniques of literary expressions that were established in the most ancient Canaanite dialects. We find, first of all, many words common to both the Ugaritic and the biblical literatures. Rosh, head, Shemayim, heaven, Eretz, earth or land, are just a few examples. And on page 23 we read, many contemporary biblical scholars continue to take for granted that the Israelites borrowed from the Canaanites almost everything essential: language, elements of religion, and knowledge of agriculture. This occurred, scholars believe, as a result of the well-known phenomenon of cultural assimilation, denying the historicity of the book of Joshua, where it related that a large number of Canaanite city-states were destroyed together with their inhabitants. These scholars argued that the Joshua narratives are largely fictional. The Israelites did not conquer Canaan in a series of wars. They rather settled gradually in the sparsely populated hill country, far from the Canaanite centers of power. The above material was quoted to show how Western historians have played down and have sought to conceal the Canaanite origin of Jewish culture. The reason? It is obvious. The Canaanites were black. The book of Joshua is very important because it contains the fulfillment of Yahweh's promise to give to the descendants of Abraham the land of the Canaanites. Yet, excavations conducted at Tel Es Sultan, 1951 to 1957, by the British School of Archaeology, totally disproves the historicity of a Jewish conquest of Canaan. The supposed destruction of the walled city of Jericho leading to the downfall of Canaan, was no more than a creation of priests writing during the exile, about 700 years after the alleged event. The only finding of the dig was a group of walled towns, dating way before the Israelite period. Some even dated back to 6800 BC. Let's examine one of the most desperate attempts to whiten the Hamites. The Coptic language is classified by white historians as Semitic. Now, what is the Coptic language? The word Copt is the Arabic corruption of Quoft, of the Greek word Egyptos or Egyptos, from which is derived Egypt. The Coptic language is the very same language of the ancient Egyptians with dialectical modifications that survives today in the liturgies of the Coptic, Ethiopian, Cushite, Abyssinian Christian Church. In fact, it was spoken in Ethiopia for over 1,000 years after the fall of the Khemetic kingdom, until the Islamic invasion drove it out of popular use and into the sanctuary of the church. So, if Coptic is Semitic, then the ancient Egyptians are Semitic. No one will try this, and so are the Ethiopians. In fact, all biblical scholars make extensive use of the Coptic language to clarify the meaning of obscure and archaic so-called Semitic words, as well as to understand the writings of the ancient Egyptians. When we study the people of Canaan and Phoenicia, we find that in their fashion of dressing and picturing their deities, they followed the Khemetic pattern so closely that oftentimes you could not tell one from the other. If historians classify the Coptic language as Semitic in full knowledge, that is, the survival of the ancient Khemetic language, does this not show duplicity at work? But they had to do it on compulsion of the principle that makes a bad lie be followed with the most idiotic of lies, i.e., after having made the Canaanites and Phoenicians white, they had to make the ancient Egyptian language in its Coptic form Semitic. In all of this, we must not lose sight of the biblical table of nations that tells us that Canaan is descended from Cush, Nubia. There is much more evidence that can be given on this point, but that would take us beyond our theme. According to the biblical table of nations, another descendant of Cush, Nubia, is Sumer, biblical Shinar. We must interpret this as meaning that these people originated in the Sudan, from where they migrated to Mesopotamia. My theory is that these were the authors of the Kadan culture, which appeared between northern Sudan and southern Egypt from 13,000 and 9,000 BC. The remains of these Paleolithic Africans include grinding stones and sickle blades, showing that they were already involved in agricultural operations. This conclusion is supported by findings of wheat-like and barley pollen in the area. I also contend that these same people, having moved out of Nubia due to the desiccation of the southern Sahara, were also the authors of the Merimden culture, 3500 BC in the Egyptian Delta. There they exhibit many of the technologies common to the Kadan and early Sumerian cultures. It is of interest to see how historians treat the subject of the racial identity of the Sumerians, whom they agree are not of the white, nor Mongolian, nor of the Far Eastern races. What is left for them to be? In The First Great Civilizations, page 37, the eminent historian Jaquetta Hawkes describes the Sumerians as follows. Their sculptures suggest that they were round-headed, with large noses slightly convex in profile, and with well-shaped lips of medium breadth. The description of a nose as slightly convex is interesting. Of course, she means not straight but rounded, i.e. broad, wide, negroid. I will let the well-shaped lips speak for themselves. Keeping with the fact that the Sumerians were ethnically and culturally similar to the Dravidians, original black inhabitants of India, I will quote R.S. Tripathi, who in History of Ancient India, page 15, says about the Dravidians that, quote, Western Asia is, however, generally supposed to have been their original abode, and the similarity of the Dravidian and Sumerian ethnic types undoubtedly lends some color to this view, end quote. And on page 30, speaking of the destruction of the black civilization of India by the invading whites, Aryans, he states, quote, the Aryans were engaged in struggles with the Dasyus, or Dasas. They were carried on with unceasing relentlessness, for the two people had strong differences, both racial and cultural. The Aryans were tall and fair, and the Dasyus were dark-skinned and of short stature. Their features were uncouth, being flat-nosed. The characteristics indicate that the Dasyus probably belonged to the Dravidian stock, end quote. It is a shame that we have to do so much detective work to get at the truth of such issues. The motive for hiding the racial identity of the Sumerians must be found in the fact that they were the source of Semitic culture. They were the first to teach the Semites, Akkadians, later Babylonians, and Assyrians how to write in their cuneiform script, mathematics, science, religion, literature, agriculture, and all the other critical elements of civilization. Their religious and secular literature, proverbs, and myths became the main source of Semitic, including Jewish religious scriptures, modified to suit their individual needs. It seems that Western historians have problems admitting to the world that they received the fundamentals of civilization from Negroes. It is just now that a handful of historians are giving credit to Kemet and Sumer, what has been dishonestly credited to the Greeks and Hebrews. The importance of dealing with the subject of the racial identity of the great black nations who founded civilization in this manner will become more and more evident later in this book. For now, let's realize the following. 1. The contemporary major world cultures, religions, and esoteric teachings are adaptations of the cultures of the black founders of civilization. 2. These adaptations have veiled the true original values and purpose of the original cultures. 3. As a result of the veiling of the true elements of civilization, the world, suffering from the cultural domination of the Western nations, has fallen into a state of decadence and is verging on the brink of destruction from nuclear war and social decay. 4. The majority of the material floating around as esoteric teaching suffers from the same perversion. We will see, for example, that the vast literature of Kabbalistical science as known to date is such a distortion of the original traditions that students of the subject can only but fail to achieve the lofty goals promised by it. Similarly, a great part of the material passing as the spiritual wisdom of India is in reality the work of the white conquerors of India speculating on the black tradition, which is the true foundation of Hindu culture, as the esoteric tradition in Europe, Rosicrucian, Kabbalism, etc., is based on the above-mentioned traditions. It too is in a similar position. Very few people are aware of the fact that the Kabbalistical tradition is in reality a polytheistic, syntheistic system. The so-called archangels of each sphere of the tree of life are exact correlates to the deities in other traditions. In fact, most of them were taken directly from Canaanite sources. Long before the formation of Israel, El, or Al, was the generic name for the deity in Canaan. We thus find the term combined with others to denote the various aspects of God. Angel, Archangel, Michael, Raphael, Hanael, Elohim, Israel, etc. In order to have a wisdom, esoteric, mystical tradition without seeming to be polytheistic, The Hebrews changed the Canaanite Phoenician deities into so-called angels, virtues, heroes, and names of God. Shaddai, which was a Canaanite deity, appears as the name of God, incorrectly rendered Almighty, at the ninth sphere of the Tree of Life. Raphael, El Hills, not the true meaning, appears incorrectly as the angel associated to the sixth sphere, and so on. A careful study of the literature of the Kabbalah, the Old and New Testament, will reveal that the angels depicted perform most of the functions of the deities of other so-called polytheistic cultures, like Elegba of the Yorubas, for example. Raphael, the, quote, airy angel, is a mediator between God and the prophets, mediums. John L. Mackenzie states in his Dictionary of the Bible that, quote, the conceptions of the angels in the Gospels does not advance beyond the Old Testament conception, and in some ways is less imaginative. The angel is still primarily a messenger or a member of the heavenly retinue, and there is not always a sharp distinction between the angel as a personal being and as a personification of the divine word or the divine action, end quote. The latter forms the most important part of the statement, personification of the divine word or the divine action. It is of great importance to find a professor of Judeo-Christian divinity referring to the angels as personifications of the divine word. The divine word is, of course, a reference to the hikal, mantras, and words of power that are used in other traditions to invoke the angels or deities. This fact underscores one of the greatest shortcomings of Hebrew Kabbalah. While the Hebrew Kabbalah conceals and downplays the fact that angels are to be invoked to possess the spirit of the mediator, in the African tradition, the angels, deities are openly invoked. They possess the spirit and borrow the bodies of the mediators to heal, counsel, admonish, teach the community, and carry out many other functions. Hebrew Kabbalists, obviously limited by the need to avoid the image of practicing polytheism, which they are indeed practicing, have thus limited and distorted their understanding of Kabbalah, in place of guiding the student of Kabbalah to the mystical experience of the deity, angel itself, in order to comprehend the spheres and principles of the Tree of Life. They engage the student in a host of intellectual speculations regarding the realities of the metaphysical world. In order to understand the true message of the black founders of civilization, we have to identify the original tradition and separate it from the contemporary hybrid cultures. This can only be done by making correspondences to the cultures of the nations that are the present-day survivors of Kemet, Canaan, Sumer, etc. These are the contemporary African and black Indian nations. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Source of the Light of the East. While in the past decade a great deal of progress has been made, at least among black scholars, to document the fact that the Khemeticians, the people of ancient Egypt, authors of the great pharaonic civilization, were blacks, a great deal remains to be done to show that the authors of the great civilizations of India, Sumer, and Canaan, Phoenicia were also black. Although the facts have been clearly known by white scholars from time immemorial, there has been a conspiracy to hide it from the world. It is the mere product of the inability of Europeans to cope with the fact that the greatest contributions to the establishment of civilization, religion, science, geometry, algebra, astronomy, mathematics, writing, etc., were made by the same race that they enslaved and dispersed throughout the Americas. One of the greatest losses that mankind has suffered from this distortion of history is the inability to truly understand the great spiritual wisdom of antiquity. Scholars have resorted to all sorts of intellectual speculation about spiritual matters that can only be known through direct experience and practice. How else but through speculation can one discover the true meaning of teachings and beliefs for which there are either no written records or that has come down to us shrouded in the veil of allegories and myths? One may ask with apparent justification, but there is an alternative. Once it is realized that the wisdom of antiquity was that of the same blacks who are today still dwelling in India, sub-Saharan Africa, etc., then the alternative will be made clear. Through one-to-one correspondences, for example, if I note similarities between the West African Yoruba deity Obatala and the Dravidian goddess Tara, whose mantra is Aum, and the Khemetic deity Asar, whose name conceals the mantra Aum, I can test my hypothesis with the existing rituals of Obatala, the goddess Tara, and the surviving material about Asar. This work has been done extensively for the past 16 years by the priests and priestesses of the Asar Osset Society, with the results that a syncretism between all black civilizations, past and present, has been achieved. Very few people realize that the yoga teachings that are being disseminated throughout the world are fundamentally a creation of Africans. Hinduism as we know it today is a blend of prehistoric Western European religion with many systems extracted from the original African cultural base. The earliest evidences of yogic practices date back around 3000 BC. Figurines of men seated in the lotus pose, and symbols of Shiva and Shakti, the main symbols of ancient Black Dravidian spiritual culture, were found in the excavated ruins of the two oldest centers of civilization in the Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These cities were nearly laid out with rectangular city blocks, streets crossing each other at right angles, brick houses, public baths with steam heating, underground sewer systems, etc., as early as 3000 BC. And they were senselessly destroyed by whites, the Vedic Aryans, who invaded them and conquered the area between 1500 and 800 BC. In The History of Ancient India, published Motilal Bannersar Dias, 1967, Rama Shankar Tripathi gives the following descriptions of the Dravidians who have been identified as the originators of the esoteric wisdom of India. The Dravidians, so called from the Sanskrit term Dravida, were one of the earliest cultured races of India. Western Asia is, however, generally supposed to have been their original abode, and the similarity of the Dravidian and Sumerian ethnic types undoubtedly lends some color to this view. The Dravidians were conversant with the use of metals, and their pottery was of improved type. They knew agriculture and were perhaps the earliest people to build dams across rivers for irrigation purposes. They constructed houses and fortifications, as observed by Dr. L.D. Barnett. Dravidian society was, to some extent, matriarchal. They worshipped the mother goddess and a host of spirits. Footnote: the mother goddess is the synthesis of 10 major goddesses of India, the Dasha Vidyas. Their words of power were later syncretized to the yogic system. For example, was the word of power of the goddess Tara long before it was assimilated into the yogic system as we know it today. End of footnote. They worshipped the mother goddess and a host of spirits. Presumably, the Dravidians were identical with the Dasas or Dasyus of the Rig Veda. Of great importance in the above quotation is the reference to the ethnic similarity between the Dravidians, the Sumerians, and the Dasas or Dasyus, since it is well known from the written Vedantic records that the Dasyus were black people and that the Dravidians are black-skinned, Krishna Tavak. Footnote: Krishna means black. End of footnote. As we know from the fact that they are still in existence, we must conclude that the Sumerians were black. Tripathi informs us that the Dasyus were dark-skinned and of short stature. Their features were uncouth, being flat-nosed, anasa. These characteristics indicate that the Dasyus probably belonged to the Dravidian stock, then occupying the parts over which the Aryans were seeking to establish their domination. Many of the Dasas became slaves of the conquerors, having been admitted into the society as Sudras, but others retired into the jungles and mountain fastnesses, where we still find their descendants living in primitive conditions. It is of great interest to learn that the creators of one of the greatest civilizations are today living, quote, in primitive conditions due to the barbaric act of conquest of others. Regarding the origin of the system of yoga, Vivian Worthington states the following in A History of Yoga. We shall see how yoga appeared in the Indus Valley at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. It is carried on as Saramnism through the Aryan, Brahminical, and Vedic periods. Although fiercely contested and often persecuted by the Brahmins, its main writings, the Upanishads, were later adopted by the Brahminical establishment and tagged on at the end of the Vedas, thus changing the whole complexion of Hinduism into its modern form known as Vedanta. Regarding the nature of the religion practiced by the inhabitants of pre-Aryan India, the Dravidians, Worthington states the following. Although Tantra received its philosophical basis from the Vajrayana school of Mahayana Buddhism, footnote, it is not true that Tantra received its philosophy from Buddhism, as its philosophy appears in the Upanishads, which preceded Buddhism. End of footnote. Its history is much older and takes us back to the early Shramadic stream of Indian thought. In its active aspect, it can be looked on as a modern development of very ancient magical and fertility rites. In the excavations at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa can be found traces of the worship of the male principle in the form of the lingam, phallus, and of the female principle in the form of the yoni, vulva. From these early practices developed the Siva Shakti cult, which is so prominent a feature of Tantrism. These early tantric practices were suppressed by the Aryans. Of the whites who came later and destroyed the civilization of the Dravidians, Tripathi states, the Aryans were tall and fair. The general opinion is that the Indo-Aryans, as also the Avestan Iranians, were a branch of the ancient Indo-Germanic peoples or the Wairos, and before their eastward migration, they occupied for long a common habitat which has been variously located in Central Asia. Max Muller. This belief rests on the grounds of the close similarity between the speech as presented in the Rig Veda and the Avestan and the Indo-Germanic tongues. The whites imposed a rigid caste, apartheid system in which the priest, Brahmins, held absolute power, followed by the secular leaders, kings, military men, etc. Kshatriyas, followed by the Vaisnas, who made up the merchant class, and last, the blacks, the Sudras, who could only engage in manual labor, cow-herding, agriculture, etc. Needless to say that the whites were the only ones who could belong to the two higher castes, and Orientals and mulattoes belonged to the third. Intercaste marriage was prohibited. Nevertheless, they occurred. M. Kunte, in his book, Vicissitudes of Aryan civilization in India relates. Intermarriages between the Aryas and the Shudras, Kolis, and other aborigines were frequent. The class of what the Americans contemptuously style mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons multiplied. The new masters also outlawed the religion of the blacks, as they made their religion the official one of the land. This caused the religion of the blacks, which involved cosmology, meditation, deity invocation, predominantly goddesses, hatha yoga, pranayama, mantra yoga, kundalini yoga, yantras, spiritual initiations, talismanic magic, tantric rituals, etc., to break up into separate practices. Lacking the benefit of carrying on their training and practice in the organized manner that freedom would have allowed, the priests led individual existences in the safety of the forest. They were the rishis, who had to hide and teach in the forest as they were bitterly persecuted by the Brahmins, Aryan priests. As time went on, several quote-unquote traditions emerged as these individual priests, varying in degrees of knowledge and ability, colored the material with their individual insight, temperament, opinions, ignorance, etc. In A History of Yoga, Vivian Worthington informs us that the Aryan religion was brutal and materialistic. The caste system was rigid and oppressive, and the Brahmins wielded great power. The Saramanas, as the yogis and other independent thinkers and teachers were known, were tolerated when the priests were not strong enough to eliminate them, but were hunted down and killed and driven out of the area where the priest had full control. It is interesting to note how Vivian Worthington sidesteps the reason for the Brahminical persecution of the Saramanas. Instead of stating that they were persecuted because they were black, as any historian of ancient India must know, she makes it seem as if their persecution were due to their independent thinking. She knows very well, as shown in her book, that the Saramanas were practitioners of yoga, tantra, so-called mother goddess worship, etc. I have given these quotations to show the depth of racism and deception that exists in the Western reporting of history. The Dravidians, Saramanas, Rishis, Yogis, succeeded, however, in one thing. By around 872 BC, they wrote down their cosmological knowledge in the first of the Upanishads, which dealt a death blow to the religion of the whites, the Vedas. It must be noted that the Vedic Aryan tradition has been totally abandoned in India since then to this day. These doctrines, which were interpretations of the prehistoric Dravidian religion, gave rise to Samkhya philosophy, Gautama's Buddhism, and Jainism. Gautama's Buddhism, which was called the Hinayana, little vehicle, was not able to transform people's being because it was lacking in the techniques to achieve its lofty philosophy. So, after his death, it was in danger of dissolution as it was kept alive in great measure by his charisma. To ensure its survival, his disciples, against his rules, blended his teachings with the tantric traditions of the blacks. This aspect of Buddhism, which is called Mahayana, the great vehicle, was able to transform people's being as it is based on the causal psychophysical principles that control man's behavior and growth. Footnote: these are the mantras, or words of power. End of footnote. Gautama's Buddhism is based in part on intellectualism and on the adherence to a code of conduct which is in reality the effect and not the cause of spirituality. In other words, it failed because 1. Intellectual activity cannot transform behavior, and 2. It is a confusion of category and ignorance of psychology and spiritual laws to try to make people good by telling them to behave good. You have to engage them in some activity which, without their conscious effort, results in the desired behavior. This latter is the foundation of Tantrism, the religion of the blacks, and Mahayana Buddhism, which is based on the Tantras. Incidentally, it must be noted that as the original Buddhism, Gautama's Hinayana was against the practices of deity invocation, mantric chanting, and was also anti-woman. In conformity with this Aryan parentage, its followers, upon merging it with the goddess-based Tantrism, took the mantras that corresponded to the goddesses and syncretized it with their male Dhyani Buddhas. For example, the mantra Aum, which is the word of power used by blacks from prehistory in their invocation of the goddess Tara, the embodiment of man's divine perfection on earth, became some 2,500 years later the mantra of the Dhyani Buddha Vairocana. Similarly, the mantra Hum of the wisdom goddess Chinnamasta became the mantra of the Dhyani Buddha Aksobhaya, and so on. In this manner, Buddhism was able to survive as these mantras gave to their adherents the power to achieve the spiritual virtues that these Dhyani Buddhas represented. Before this, their followers would study the philosophy, aspire to realize the virtues, but fail in their aspirations for the lack of the power to achieve. It is not enough to understand. You must have the power of realization. In addition, this syncretism enabled them to convert many of the blacks who could now worship their deities in the guise of the Dhyani Buddhas. This is similar to what blacks did thousands of years later in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, etc. They syncretized the African deities with the Christian saints, which were originally black deities. Things come back in strange guises. Buddhism, once syncretized with the black religion as its power base, was spread throughout India and Sri Lanka by the Emperor Ashoka, 264 to 227 BC. It then spread to China, 65 AD. In 552 AD, the Hindu sage Bodhidharma founded the Chan or Zen aspect of Buddhism in China. In 747 AD, the Hindu sage Padma Sambhava introduced Tantric Buddhism to Tibet. In 1191 AD, Eisai founded the Rinzai sect in Japan, and in 1300 AD, Dogen founded the Soto Zen sect around 1500 AD. The Tantric black religion was merged with Islam to give rise to Sufism. From China, India, Tibet, and Japan, this tradition spread to the rest of the Orient. Today, those who do not know the history of the yogic tradition nor understand its inner constitution speak of the, quote, light of the East, when in reality it is a modification of the light taken by the blacks from Nubia into the Tigris and Indus Valley in prehistoric times. Anyone who takes the time to become acquainted with the pre-Aryan religion of India, e.g. see the Agni Puranam published by the Chaukamba Sanskrit series, Varanasi, India, will see that it is the parent of all the fragmentary systems in vogue throughout the Orient. And that is the unfortunate truth. In place of the Dravidian integral system of living and spiritual development, we are being offered its fragments colored by Aryan speculation into the nature of the spiritual dimension. This latter form of Hinduism, the latest reaction against the Tantric yogic system of the blacks of India, is known as Vedanta. It is the form that has been introduced into the West. We must also note that another factor that has hidden the black origins of the Tantric yogic system has been the fact that it has been presented to the world through translations into the Sanskrit language. And to make matters worse, due credit has never been given to the black people who created the system. What else is new? End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Cosmology and cosmogony. Imagine the following scenario. You have come up on a man busily engaged in constructing something with wood, bricks, cement, etc. He is mixing cement in a kitchen blender, digging holes with a spoon, nailing boards with a rock. He has already shattered 20, and so on. Might be your first reaction. What are you doing? Building a house? Isn't it obvious? The familiar salt. Right, you nod. What kind of house? Don't know, as he picks up some cement with a fork and pours it into the blender. Shouldn't you be using the right kind of equipment? You attempt to bring some sanity into the conversation. What do you mean? Can't you see that these are working fine? And how? You quip. Well, let me see your blueprint. A what? What is that? He drops everything and transfixes you with an honest, quizzical look. As you are by now begging for this scenario to end, I will end it. But it is not really the end, as it is a good replica of how most people conduct their lives. Don't be too quick to exempt yourself. By chapter 10, you will be thinking very differently due to the lack of knowledge of self and the purpose of life. Most people in the world are going about the daily business of living with wrong ideas of what is life, what should be their true goals, how to correctly achieve their goals. There is not the slightest awareness that there ought to be, or that there actually exists a blueprint to guide our steps in life to the true fulfillment of our mission on earth. Such a blueprint is called a cosmogony. Cosmology, the study of cosmogony, has two fundamental goals. First, it provides an ordered and unified view of who and what is God, man, and the forces that administrate and sustain the world. No understanding of a subject can take place without an ordered and unified presentation of its whole and parts. Second, cosmology, like all blueprints and maps, provides a framework that guides thinking and action through the vast array of seemingly unrelated life situations to the successful identification and attainment of the goal of living. It achieves this by showing how all the events in a person's life are integrally related to his or her destiny. Through it, it is revealed the spiritual value of each and every event in a person's life. With a partial view of man's identity, and worse, no knowledge of his origin and destiny, people go on to create innumerable institutions, life goals, and undertakings. What if someone offered proof to the world that all things making up the world are integral and inseparable, functional and structural components of one being? The unity of all things in the world can be understood by the study of biological entities, as they are based on the same cosmogonical structure or blueprint. The human body, for example, is made up of thousands of different types of cells, numbering in the billions. Yet, they are all parts of one entity. They represent one life, and not billions of separate existences. Although each cell has its own individual need, the nourishment that one cell receives doesn't take care of the others. Yet, we all know too well what happens when even one cell begins to go its own way. Cancer. In spite of having individual needs, like all other creatures of this earth, their activities interrelate to maintain the one being which they collectively compose. But how do we know that all the cells in the body are integral parts of a whole? The answer is simple. Their interdependence, the harmony and order governing their interaction, and the fact that their individual activities can be shown to add up to the life of the whole they compose. Running through all the disciplines studying living things, biology, physiology, biochemistry, etc., as well as all other sciences, are the factors of order, interdependence, relationship, and the integration of seemingly separate things into a whole. It is most interesting to note that the Western world does not have a fully organized science of the shaping factors of order, harmony, etc., that permeates all sciences. Such a science, known in various degrees of sophistication to most non-Western nations, is known as cosmology. The term cosmology means the study of order. Cosmos from the Greek kos, meaning order. It occurs in such words as kosmetas, an epithet of the Greek god Zeus, meaning the orderer. We also find it in cosmetics and mathematics, from the Greek mathematikos. It is easy to see the relationship of the meaning of the term with the subject treated in mathematics. The term's antonym is chaos. Webster's New World Dictionary, Second College Edition, defines it thus: the disorder of formless matter and infinite space, supposed to have existed before the ordered universe. Synonym: see confusion. Although this fairly common definition establishes its relation to cosmos, it has a major flaw. How can there be disorder and confusion in a formless medium? The text is clear that there are two states: one in which matter is formless, incorrectly equated with disorder, and the other of a later existence in which there is order. Implied is that here matter is formed or ordered. We must go further and note that the term chaos is a very clever coinage. It is composed of, quote, a, the article of indefiniteness, sandwiched into the term kos, chaos. To appreciate this fully, we must realize that indefiniteness denotes the absence of form. All forms are ordered or defined states of substance. Hence, chaos, or formless, undefined matter. In other words, the indefinite article a denies the existence of order in the term chaos. Yet, in all truth, we will see that cosmology, the study of order, must start with the study of chaos. For the ordered realm is a mirror reflection, according to its own laws, of the non-ordered realm. Keeping the above firmly in mind, it will be easy to see that present-day Westerners have perverted the meaning of the words that are akin to kos. Cosmos is generally defined as the world and universe. Cosmogony as the theory of the genesis and development of the world and universe. Macrocosm as the great world or universe, and microcosm, anything that is regarded as a world in miniature, mankind, society, man, etc. What is at work here is the Western polarization in thingish thinking about a term that represents an abstract reality. Such thinking has kept Westerners from seeing that the so-called creation myths of blacks are mytho-scientific expositions of how to bring order into an area where there is none. The grand theme of the cosmological mytho-scientific literature of the black spiritual tradition is the absence of order in the early part of the man's life. Illnesses, social decay, and wars run rampant as a result. As long as this state exists, prayers, words of power, rituals, science, all measures are of no avail. This is the state that all Western nations find themselves in to date. The bringing of order into the situation is the first prerequisite for the correction of all the ills. The value of these mythoscientific expositions resides in their appeal to the right side of the brain, which uses them as means of creating order in all other situations in our life. This is due to its synthetical ability.